Shabbat Shalom again. Shabbat Shalom and welcome to everybody. It's always good to be here together. Very early in my rabbinate, I officiated at a Shabbat morning service. I gave a sermon based on the Parsha, bringing in a few meforshim, a few commentaries, and I thought I had done a good job. A few days later, I saw an older colleague who asked me how I dealt with the tragedy that had taken place in Israel the previous week during services, and I told him, well, I didn't address it. And he reprimanded me. He said, how can you be praying for peace? How can you pray for Israel without speaking about the realities of our day? Whether it be Israel or whether it be peace, whether it be issues of freedom, justice, human suffering, that which is going on in the world are the most important religious concerns. It should always be part of your talk, always be part of your teaching. And I learned that. I know that there are certain weeks where there is a voice inside of me that says, there's nothing you can speak about but this. I was born in the early 1950s. Those were good years in this country, as you know. Years of great growth and optimism. And then came the 60s, and things were changing pretty radically. The civil rights movement, an unconscionable war, and a resulting peace movement. There were protests, there were assassinations. We lived through the 1967 war in Israel and all that took place after that. The movement for women's rights, the times were a-changing, as we learned. I remember the rabbis very well from those days, and I remember how they courageously spoke to the most important issues. They saw themselves as part of a prophetic tradition that demanded a voice which would speak out against injustice or hatred, racism, bigotry. You know, the prayers in our Siddur reflect that, and certainly we see that in the prayer for the country. By and large, with the exception of a few regions in this country and just a few congregations, the words of the rabbis reflected the sentiments of their congregants. By the way, there were a few rabbis who lost their jobs because they critiqued governmental policies regarding either civil rights or the war in Vietnam. Men that stood up against segregation and racism and war. By and large, you know, our tradition does reflect liberal values. And by that I mean the values of the Enlightenment that reflect the dignity of every human being, the rights of individuals, freedom and justice. And that is what our rabbis tapped into. Like so much of the world, things are different today in all of our communities because the world is so fragmented. Economic forces, autocratic dictatorships, rising nationalism has created great divisions in this country, in the world, and rifts within our own people, within the Jewish people. You know that, and I know that too. Viewing Judaism as a values proposition, I often wonder how Jews can hold certain positions. But I will admit that I understand it's also part of being human. People see things from their own places, based on their own experiences, knowing what they have learned, understanding who influenced them, and also realizing their priorities of values. And I recognize that that's part of our Torah also. It's a Torah of pluralism with multiple voices and multiple approaches. And yet I carry a deep and dark perception right now. I'm fearful. I'm fearful about this world. I'm fearful about Israel. I'm very disturbed. And I can share it. I know that I can share it with you. And I can know that I can share it even if there is disagreement. because I do believe that we have a tradition based on that dialectics that include disagreement. My concern right now is that Israel is truly facing a critical existential threat. Unlike past times in recent history where the threat came from outside, today the threat is within. And history has taught us a few things which lead to my angst. One, as E.J. Lieserman said in our class yesterday, no nation, no empire lives forever. Somehow, perhaps chauvinistically, we think that our empire is different. Well, we may have survived and outlived other empires, and particularly those that oppressed us, like the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, but we never outlived them as a nation on our own soil. We've survived as a people in the diaspora. We've been around as a people for more than 3,000 years. And now we're living in what is known as the Third Commonwealth. Each Commonwealth was a period when we had autonomy and independence in our own land. But do you know the time that we're talking about? The measure of that time? Well, think about it. We've been around for perhaps 3,000 or more than 3,000 years as a people. But the first Commonwealth lasted 80 years. Just 80 years. That was the time of the first temple. The second Commonwealth, that lasted 80 years. That was the time of the second temple. This then is the third Commonwealth. Israel is soon to turn 75 years old. And we have to understand that there are no guarantees. The other fact of history is that great empires do not destruct because of external forces. Rather, they are destroyed by internal forces, divisions that arise that weaken the nation. Civil wars often are followed by destruction. So our people are fractured right now. They are divided by essential values. And the values are about some of the very issues that we've been learning and speaking about here together for 30 years. Democracy, pluralism, living with the other, how we use power, how we make peace. Before the Megillah reading on Monday evening, I mentioned a reference to chapter 9 in Megillat Esther, and how as I aged every year, that chapter began to haunt me more and more. Some 75,000 Persians were murdered by what appeared to be marauding gangs in distant areas. A lot of questions about that needed to be asked and answered about that text. And we've ignored it. We've ignored it because we're so deeply bothered by it. And of course, the biggest concern is what fundamentalists, or how fundamentalist readers read that text and what they take from that text in terms of their own lives. Yet, it doesn't get in the way of our celebration, or perhaps we can say, well, evil was eradicated. But was it? And what do we learn? Anyway, I mentioned that my heart was heavy. It was particularly because of the attack by the settlers in the town of Hurara. It took place at the end of February, and preceding that attack, there were 2 young Israeli brothers who were brutally murdered. We all know about the amount of violence that continues to be perpetrated, this cycle of violence, Palestinian terrorists, Israeli responses, Israeli settlers, Palestinian responses, and it's led to an untenable situation which is evoking the worst in people and in our own people. The perpetrator of the murders was found. However, then it was followed by an attack described by a senior IDF official as a pogrom. A pogrom. It was not against the defensive Jewish population as we have known in history, but it was against Palestinians living in a village surrounded by Jewish settlements cut off from their Palestinian family members. More than 10 homes were set on fire, some with residents in them. Cars were set on fire, shops were burned, windows were broken, and the IDF did not show up. And at night, these settlers gathered together and davened Mariv, with the fires burning in front of them. There's a cycle of violence that's intolerable, and lawlessness is reigning. And the beginnings, and the violence will not end as long as an occupation continues. Days after the rampage, far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, who has responsibility for aspects of Israel's West Bank administration, said, Huwara should be erased. You know what? That's Nazi language. Although a few of the 100-plus attackers were detained, as of now, not one of them has been charged with a crime. In the context of what we learned last week from Professor Neda Barak-Koren regarding the move to change the judiciary system in Israel, there are really serious problems about the nature of Israel and the future of Israel's democracy and its judiciary. A collateral result right now is that the shekel is losing value. I'm sure many of you saw Mike Bloomberg's dire warnings about the loss of democracy and an economy imploding. And so many in the startup nation are leaving. Huge protests are turning violent. I spoke about the fact that people hold different perceptions. You know, if you see the territories as being God-given land and read today's politics through the lens of the Bible or the Megillah, then this land will never and should never be compromised. But if you believe that security and peace and a good future and if you believe that security and peace can be achieved by the occupation of a people, then we'll continue to see the growth and this cycle of violence. But if you see the land as being part of a strategy, as it were, to help create a peaceful people, to help create security for the Jewish people, a place where there can be a full, rich, valued, democratic Jewish life, or life for all the citizens of Israel. And we understand that we're not alone either in that region or in this world, that there are other residents and citizens. We need to build security in a way that the world will be advocates and the politics will be driven by not just the reality of yesterday, but also today and with hope for tomorrow. Then you see things differently. We read in the Torah today about the building of the Egel HaZahav, or that was part of this week's Parsha, the golden calf. And the question is asked, how could the people have done that? They just experienced the miracles of God, the one God, the God who could not be seen and had no form. How could they do that? And one of the commentaries indicated that they did it because that's what they knew. Living in Egypt for hundreds of years, golden calves were worshipped. We understand as an enlightened people that previous experiences do form our attitudes for today, and they're quite complex. We've experienced a lot of cruelty, violence, oppression. You know, sometimes that sensitizes people to the way they treat others. But sometimes it makes them cruel. It makes them oppressors. Soon it will be Pesach, and we'll think about what the meaning of that enslavement would have on our own future as a people. Would we one day become powerful and repeat the horrors that we experienced, or would we become a different type of people? Would we use our experience to become empathic with others who suffer and others who are oppressed, or could we become oppressors? In the Haggadah we read, B'chol dor v'ador chayav adam lerot et atzmo ke'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. Every generation, a person's obligated to see himself or herself as if he or she came out of Egypt. That's part of our psychic challenge. It takes courage as individuals to see how our own personal traumas shaped us. Individually, all people face that. To become mature and to self-actualize, we have to face it. But it also takes courage as a people, as a community, to be able to look at our earlier traumas and see how it impacted us, and how we face them, and how they change us, and what we could become because of them. Looking closely at the text, we also see something else. The golden calf was created because the people yearned for direction. It doesn't say in the text that they built a golden calf because they were looking for a god. Rather, it says they were waiting for Moses to come down from the mountain. They didn't see Moses, and so they built a golden calf. They needed a leader. And perhaps that's one of the great challenges that we too are facing as Jews, with our variety of organizations and our nation, that we need fresh voices, fresh leadership. We need direction because we must be able to point out a better way, and we have to work to move in that way. I don't want to leave you here because I know that much of my upset and frustrations are shared by so many of you, and we ask the question, so what do we do? We're just individual people with limited access to power, limited control of what goes on. So I've said some of this before, and I will repeat it again because I do think there are things that we can do. First of all, as a people who love Israel, we have to remain engaged with her. There are many organizations and projects in schools that work for democracy, that are trying to create a civil society, that work for equality and coexistence and religious pluralism, that understand that this government and its rejection of other religious streams or its rejection of women's involvement in the public sphere of religion or its rejection of people in the gay community, that this is not who we are. And so we should be focusing our attention, and we should be helping those places that will and work to make a difference in Israel. If you express a desire like that, I have a list of such organizations and such schools. Secondly, we have to express ourselves to the organizations that we already support, those who are not addressing the critical issues, but continuing their work as if things are going on like normal. It's not. Israel is in deep trouble. Protests are closing down businesses and cities and highways, and violence is emerging. So we have to demand of our organization that they address these critical issues. It's the issue essentially about democracy. And so whether you're a member of National Council of Jewish Women or Hadassah, whether you're involved in Federation or AIPAC, raise your voice. If you buy Israel bonds, let the organization know that you're concerned about these things. It's so important. It's not business as usual, and it hasn't been for a while. And third, we need to get involved in the issues that matter to us, that reflect our values in this world. I'm happy to tell you in a few weeks I'm going with a group of rabbis on an educational mission to the Mexican border that's being led by HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, such an important organization, an organization that was so important to many of your parents and grandparents, and certainly to my parents and grandparents. It's just a little drop in a bucket of education and advocacy for humanity, but it's so important. And finally, we need to double down on our efforts to strengthen the synagogue and to strengthen our schools and everything we do for our members, old and young. Because as I said earlier, I see what we do here as a values proposition, and we are trying to teach values to our children. There's nothing more important than creating a strong community, and for us, it's creating a strong community here. We've got a job. We're doing well, and may we continue to increase, to grow a real religious life that reflects what we think religion should be about. And it contains learning, music, and worship, and meaningful community. And you know how well we do that here and how much more we have to do, as we have become a central point in this community to serve underserved populations, be they the hungry or the homeless. And we have to continue to strengthen that because that's part of our essential values as a Jewish people. And we must stay together doing it, and I think we will. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.